Hello, I'm Jason Lehman.
Hello, I'm Mark Bryan.
And we're here from UBI Lab Sheffield to introduce the Basic Income Pilot for Sheffield proposal. So we've got three principles: fair, efficient, democratic, and these are the principles for what we think the tax and benefit system should be. So fair in that everyone is valued and everyone contributes. Efficient in that it is minimising unnecessary bureaucracy, that kind of load on people in the welfare system, and democratic in that essentially it's giving more power to people, it's supporting people as individuals, giving them power in terms of giving them sort of financial power, which then gives them power to do more with their lives and shape their lives as they wish.
And we think that Sheffield is an ideal place to do a UBI pilot. It's a city of communities. It's a city on 7 hills with a diversity of different communities. And 2 of our pilots have a community focus. It's also a city of networks with multiple stakeholders. So we have 2 universities, we have businesses, we have civil society groups, social entrepreneurs. It's a city of innovation. So we have entrepreneurship, we have makers, we have artists. It's also a city of research and expertise, so we've got centres of research in robotics, artificial intelligence, and also social sciences.
And so we're interested in the effect of UBI really upon sort of the whole human experience, essentially. So rather than focusing on a specific aspect, we're interested in the impact on activities, what people do for work, what they do in their spare time. We're interested in the impact on relationships, so relationships within the family, within the household, relationships between people in the community. Also interested in well-being in terms of health, mental health and physical health, but also financial well-being, how settled people feel financially. And also the impact upon place, so how people relate with their neighbourhood, what they're doing in the neighbourhood, and also the wider environment, for example, just how much people recycle and so on. So really a wide view of what basic income might impact upon.
And we have 3 options to explore these questions. The first option we're calling the tweak, and this is an option which is focused on disabled people, and in particular people who receive one of the current disability benefits, which is called employment and support allowance. And employment and support allowance is quite a complicated benefit. People have to go through a work capability assessment to decide which ESA group they're going to be put into. A lot of people have to go through means testing to decide the level of the ESA they're going to get. And there are also rules about how much work they can do when they're on ESA. So what we would do is effectively get rid of a lot of that complication and turn ESA into a basic income. So we'd remove the conditionality testing, we'd remove the work capability assessment, we'd remove the means testing, and we'd scrap the rules about how much work people can do, so that whatever people's status, whatever they do, they would receive the full value of the ESA, so it would be effectively a basic income.
So as we see here, everyone stays on the full employment support allowance payment, the support group payment, whether they're in work or not. So the study would look at a sample of 4,000 people randomly selected across Sheffield, a sample of all those who were recipients of ESA. The control group would receive ESA as normal and receive that for 3 years. And there would be a quantitative study where they would be surveyed around about 7 times, so a survey before the trial starts, and then regular surveys, perhaps biannual surveys, just to track their experience, as we said, their kind of holistic experience, holistic impact of this tweak upon what they're doing, their relationships and so on. And there would also be a qualitative study really looking in depth of around 20 to 50 people, just kind of adding a bit of rich detail to it and really finding out if there are differences evidenced by the quantitative study between the pilot group and the control group, sort of trying to dig down to say, okay, well, what's causing that? What are causing those differences? And this study would cost around 17.7 million. The proportion of that would be the actual research itself, so the interviewing and the administration of the research, and then the proportion would be because people would be staying on ESA, and therefore this would be an additional cost over and above what is usually paid.
The second of our options we're calling the top-up. So rather than being focused on disabled people, the top-up would be applied to all adults, and it would be a relatively modest payment that everybody would receive irrespective of their circumstances or their income, so it would be non-means tested, and it would be a level of £130 a month, as I said, to all adults for the period of the pilot, which will be 3 years. This wouldn't require any changes to the tax benefit system, unlike the first option. However, the top-up would be taxable, so people would pay an amount of tax depending on the marginal income tax rate that they pay. This is the kind of scheme that, if it was implemented, wouldn't necessarily require additional income taxes to pay for it, but it could be paid for using other taxes, for example, energy taxes or carbon taxes, possibly land value taxes, or possibly a sovereign wealth fund, which would be a fund where which would include some of the nation's assets, and there will be dividend paid out of that, which would pay for the top-up payment.
So the impact of the top-up would be, we think, quite different across different people. So it would go to everyone, but for example, if you look at someone in the top decile earner earning £3,700 a month, an extra £130 a month might not make that much difference. But if you go down to someone in the bottom decile earning £690 a month, that payment of £130 could really make a big impact. And so it would go to everyone, it would be uniform, but we can see that the impact of such a universal payment would actually be greatest upon those who are on the low incomes. As with option 1, we'd again be looking at 4,000 adults taking part. But in option 2, we'd be looking at a community. So rather than a random sample of people scattered about the city, we'd be looking at a particular community or maybe a couple of communities and looking at what happens in those communities when we make this payment. And this is important because then we get to look at not just the individual level effects, but the potential changes in a community as we introduce a universal basic income. And we'd compare with a similar control community using statistical matching. And what does that mean, Mark?
Statistical matching means that in order to make proper comparisons, we need to be comparing like with like. And so we'd look at the characteristics of the people in our community getting the UBI. So we'd look at how old they are, we'd look at what sort of educational qualifications they've got, what sort of ethnicity, what sort of jobs they do, that sort of thing. And we'd identify people in another community with very similar characteristics, so that then we can say that the only systematic difference between the two groups is the fact that one gets the UBI and another one doesn't.
And again, what we'd look at, as well as a quantitative study, would be having a qualitative study, digging in a kind of adds a rich context, what's going on, perhaps if we're evidencing differences between the pilot group and the control group using the statistical matching, we see differences around various things. We'd use a qualitative study to sort of dig under and say, okay, what's the mechanisms behind that? What might be producing those differences? And the projected cost of this, around £22.8 million. The large part of this would be in funding those top-up payments.
Our final pilot option is the replacement. And whereas the other two options you can call partial UBI schemes, this is really what people are thinking of when they're thinking of a full UBI scheme. And this is a scheme that reorganises and replaces the current tax benefit system. So what we have here is a representation of the income distribution, where you can see that there is a large gap as we move down between richer people and poorer people. And there are some benefits which people receive, but they don't really do much to change the distribution of income. So what the replacement would be is a payment of about £6,000 to all working age adults, and children would also receive a payment of a little bit less than that, and people over working age or retired would receive a larger payment, as would disabled people. And this UBI would replace most benefits except for housing benefit, because there's variation in housing benefit across different areas. So that's not something that we think would be in a UBI scheme. So you would still get housing benefit on top of the UBI if you were entitled to it. And it would also replace the income tax allowance. So it's very much a replacement of the current system. £6,000 would be the basic UBI payment. That would need to be financed. And unlike the top-up scheme, option 2, here we're thinking of a scheme that would need to be financed probably in large part by some kind of additional income tax. So you might think of a basic income tax to finance it. And so what we do is within this pilot, we would actually administer that. So we try and replicate the sort of taxes that you would have to pay in a full scheme to make this a realistic representation of what would happen if it was fully implemented.
So that's what we see here. If you see the first 6 columns on the graph, the sort of faded columns in the background are what people previously received and then what they would receive under the pilot. So we'd essentially take their income down, as it were, and then pay them a UBI. Now, obviously, in the pilot, all they'd get would be the difference between what they currently receive, and then the pilot payment would make the difference. So we'd essentially pay the difference, pay the additional amount. Now, obviously, we're talking about adjusting the whole tax and benefit system. There would be people above around about £25,000 a year, earning about £25,000 a year, depending on their circumstance. Above that they wouldn't be net gainers. They'd be net contributors under this model of a UBI. And so obviously, in a sense, we can't include them in the pilot because we can't ask them to, kind of pay money to be part of the pilot. What we can do is we can perhaps include them in some qualitative study to ask them how would they feel about making a net contribution. And if their income did fall, then they would fall into the pilot so that they would start receiving payments from the pilot as if they were receiving a UBI. So as with option 2, we'd be interested in looking at a community again, or a couple of communities, and haven't really got an idea about what that community might be. It might be a housing estate, a block of flats, a set of streets, but a community or a couple of communities, around 2,500 households, and then again comparing with a control community to look at those community level changes. So not just individual changes, but what's happening in the community with the introduction of a basic income. And again, this qualitative study sort of looking under the hood. Okay, we might see some differences, but kind of what's happening within people's lives that might be causing those differences, and add just a bit of extra context to that. And the cost of this around about £60 million, which might sound a lot, but actually for a large social science study in the context of general UK spend on welfare is very, very affordable indeed.
So those are our 3 options. We think that they're unique in several ways, that the Sheffield pilot is unique, and we think that for several reasons. The first one is that this would be the first full-scale pilot of a UBI in England. There's some work going on in Scotland to look into the feasibility of doing a UBI pilot in Scotland, but we believe this will be the first full-scale pilot in England, and as such, very valuable. There have been other studies elsewhere in the world, but nothing that's really relevant to the UK context, so it will be very valuable to have a pilot going on in Sheffield. The second reason we think our pilot's unique is that whereas previous pilots have often focused on work, we've got a much broader focus on activity in general. So not just paid work, but to include things like caring, volunteering, and anything else that really is valuable to individuals and communities. The third reason is because we do have this community focus, as you saw in pilots 2 and 3, which is going to allow us not just to see the effects on individuals and households, but to see whether there are going to be effects on the community as a whole. And finally, we're not just looking at objective outcomes such as employment and earnings and, say, objective physical health. We're going to be looking at well-being in a broader context. So we're going to look at things like subjective well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, the amount of meaning that people get out of the things they do, the sense of belonging, and the sense of community cohesion. So for those 4 reasons, we think that our pilot is unique and has a lot to offer. Thanks very much for watching. We hope you found that very interesting. Our contact details are on the screen, so please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye.